we are told to look to ancient Athens for the birth of civilization. We see the white marble of the Parthenon, shining under a clear blue sky. We hear the echoes of philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, debating the nature of truth, beauty, and the ideal state. We see the invention of democracy, the theater, the very concept of the citizen. But this is an illusion, a brilliant, blinding illusion, because beneath the gleaming marble, in the shadow of the Acropolis, lies another history. A history that has been silenced. It is the story of the other half of Athens, the women. In this world, a woman was not a citizen. She was a possession, first of her father, then of her husband. Her entire existence was confined to the oikos, the inner, unseen part of the household. Her value was not in her mind or her spirit. It was in her modesty, her silence, and her ability to produce a legitimate male heir. This obsession with control created a social prison. But what happened when a woman was accused of breaking its rules? What happened when she stepped out of line or was simply the victim of a fallen city? The punishment was not a simple private affair. It was not a fine or a quiet imprisonment. It was a form of public theater, a grotesque performance art designed not just to break the body, but to annihilate the soul. This is the history of social death, a set of punishments so vicious, so steeped in humiliation, that they were designed to erase a woman's very identity, turning her into a living ghost, a walking warning to all others. This is the hidden history of control, and its weapons were not always swords or chains. Sometimes they were as simple as a pair of shears, a wooden post, or an ordinary item from a market stall. The first cut was the deepest, aimed directly at a woman's identity. In ancient Greece, as in so many cultures, a woman's hair was more than just an adornment. It was a symbol. It was her pride, her femininity, her status as a free and respectable wife or daughter. Long, elaborate hair was a sign of virtue and nobility. It was a part of her very personhood. To strip it away was to strip away her honor. This is why head shaving was one of the most devastating and common forms of public humiliation. For a wife accused of adultery or a woman caught defying the authority of her kyrios, her male guardian, this punishment was a living stigma. It would not be done in private. She would be dragged into a public space, her hands bound. Her hair, which she had spent a lifetime caring for, would be hacked off, often with a blunt blade, torn away in crude handfuls. The crowd would watch, and the act itself was a violation, a forceful removal of her womanhood. In a society obsessed with clear social dividers, a shaved head marked her instantly. It was the mark of a slave. It was the brand of a disgraced woman. From that moment on, she could not hide. Every person who saw her bare scalp would know instantly that this was a woman who had broken the most sacred rules. But humiliation alone was rarely enough. The original text notes that this act was often combined with brutal beatings. Struck with rods, belts, or fists, her body would carry the dark bruises, while her bare, shorn head carried the public stigma of dishonor. The physical pain was a fire that would eventually fade. The humiliation was a poison that lasted for life. For enslaved women, this combination of violence and degradation was a daily reality. Masters would shave their heads not as a punishment, but as a uniform, a way to visually distinguish them from free women, using casual violence to reinforce their total submission. The true cruelty of this punishment, however, lay in its permanence. A physical wound could heal and scar over. A bruise would fade, but her hair, her identity, would take months, even years to return. And during all that long, slow time, she could not hide her disgrace. Every time she stepped into the market, her bare scalp spoke louder than any words. It screamed her shame to every stranger. Every glance from her neighbors was a fresh wound. In ancient Greece, to lose one's hair under punishment was to lose one's identity. It was a constant, brutal reminder that a woman's body did not belong to her. It belonged to her husband, her master, or the state. And they could take from her not only her dignity, but the very symbols of her womanhood, leaving her with nothing but the lasting, visible scar of their power. But what if the crime demanded more than a visible stigma? What if the goal was not just to mark the woman, but to make her a living sacrifice to public order? This brings us to the agony of public exposure. The original script calls this boudizo. While the specific term is obscure, the practice is all too well documented. It was not a punishment that began in a dark cell. It began in the roaring heart of the city, the Athenian agora. This was no private chamber. This was the marketplace, the hub of merchants, philosophers, politicians, and citizens. It was the very center of public life. To be dragged here, not as a free woman, but as an object of ridicule, was the ultimate degradation. The condemned woman was stripped bare, sometimes entirely, sometimes left with a single ragged cloth that only amplified the shame. She was then bound upright, often to a post or a pillar, her body exposed under the relentless, blistering Mediterranean sun. For a society obsessed with female modesty, where a good woman was one who was never seen or spoken of in public, this forced nudity was more devastating than a lash. It was the violent total reversal of her entire life's purpose, and this was not mere exposure. It was a calculated display designed to maximize her humiliation. Neighbors, traders, old men, even slaves would pass by, seeing her not as a person, but as a breathing cautionary tale. The original script is right. Children would laugh. Men would point and jeer. Some would spit or hurl refuse, fruit, or filth. The guards would do nothing. They were not there to protect her. They were there to curate the spectacle. The punishment thrived on the crowd's participation. The physical torment was a slow-burning hell. Hours under the sun burned her skin until it blistered and cracked. Without water, her mouth dried to a choking thirst, her tongue swelling. Hunger gnawed at her as weakness spread through her legs, forcing her into shameful, trembling postures she couldn't hide. The dust of the marketplace, kicked up by thousands of sandals, would cling to her sweat and any open wounds, caking her body in a final, dehumanizing layer of filth. Insects would gather, crawling freely on her wounds, in her eyes, and in her mouth. The longer she was left there, the more grotesque the spectacle became. A once respected woman, perhaps a citizen's wife, was reduced to a public warning. This is what happens when you dishonor your husband, your city, your gods. But the deepest wound was never physical. It was the complete and total erasure of her dignity. In Athens, a woman's value was tied to her household reputation. This act destroyed it in a single afternoon. The exposure was worse than a beating, because the marks it left were invisible and eternal. It left a shame that followed her home. It created whispers that poisoned her family's honor. It was a stigma that would never, ever fade. Some endured this for hours, others for a full, agonizing day. A few never returned alive, collapsing from heat stroke, dehydration, or simply left to die. The Athenians considered the punishment complete only when humiliation had run its course, and the example had been burned into the public memory. This was not meant to punish the body. It was crafted to destroy the spirit. It turned a woman's flesh into a public message. You do not belong to yourself. You belong to the city, and the city may strip you bare at will. But what could be worse than public exposure? What punishment was reserved for the most private, most sacred of crimes? What happens when humiliation becomes a performance of grotesque, symbolic violation? This is the hidden history of the radish and the fig. The original script calls this raphanidosis. This is a punishment so brutal, so specific, that it exists in a dark twilight between historical fact and cultural terror. It was the punishment rumored to befall the moichos, the adulterer, both male and female. But for the woman, it took on a unique and chilling character. It began with an object so ordinary it made the cruelty all the more chilling. A hard knobby radish, or, as the script notes, a dried fig. When we look at the brutal, ritualized shaming of the citizen women, we must remember this. The goal of those punishments, the pillar, the shears, the radish, was not just to punish the woman. It was to remind her and everyone else of the thin, fragile line separating her from the slave. It was to say, you are a wife, a daughter, a citizen, but you are one transgression away from having no identity at all. This was the true, dark architecture of the ancient world. It was a world built on a foundation of control, where the most vicious punishments were reserved not for soldiers, but for the wives, daughters, and mothers of the conquered, or even of their own. They were dragged into slavery, beaten, paraded, and marked as spoils of war. Their dignity was the final, most satisfying prize. For them, punishment wasn't confined to a prison cell. It was a public spectacle, performed to crush the spirit as much as to break the body. The goal was to leave a scar that no physical wound could match. A scar on the soul, a scar on the public memory. When we look back at the white marble of Athens, we must remember the shadows. We must remember that the philosophies of freedom and truth were debated in a marketplace where, Just a few feet away, a woman could be tied to a post, stripped bare for the crime of defiance. They were not just punished, they were erased, made into living ghosts, haunting their own lives. The philosophers wrote of the ideal city, but it is the silence of these women, the echo of their suffering, that tells the true and most human story of all.